I love it.
Okay. So take. I never know how to start this. Hello and welcome to The Wedge. I'm your host, Dr. Joyce Del Rosario. This videocast highlights Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders working towards social justice. We call it The Wedge because Asian Americans are often wedged in the black and white binary conversations on race. We are tossed around as either model minorities or the perpetual foreigners who have the kung flu. But really, API folks are positioned to help break the binary conversations to move us toward justice and equity for all people. The Wedge introduces Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who are doing great things in their community. In this first season, we will focus on API pastors, practitioners, and academics who have invested themselves in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. I hope you enjoy this series. So my guest today is, and I may butcher this, but Sandhya Jha. Yeah. And for South Asians who want to pronounce it differently, I'll let you explain why it's pronounced that way. But in fact, I'm just going to let you introduce yourself and let you share who you are. I'm just so excited to have my friend here. She's been teaching a class with me, for me, at the Pacific School of Religion, social change fieldwork. And it's been so much fun for me to learn, to glean everything from you and your experiences and your teaching. And so this is really just me, just really excited to get to share my friendship with you and your awesomeness with everyone. So
I gotta say, one of my favorite, one of the things that I've been the most excited about in the past year, Joyce, is you moving to the Bay Area. And I'm a tiny little bit bitter about the fact that we don't get to hang out right now, because I'd love to be in the space where we were just hanging out on the patio, having some iced tea and catching up, right? So I feel a little robbed. So I'm really excited that we get to teach together and get to teach with Grace, who has been someone I have valued for so long.
yes.
So yeah, it's just been a blast. So as far as who I am, my name is Sandhya Jha, or Sandhya Jha is the technical pronunciation in Bengali, and I get corrected by Hindi speakers all the time because Hindi is the more prominent language in India, and the exact same name in India is pronounced, in Hindi is pronounced Sandhya. So there are lots of people who think I've Americanized my name, but in fact I have stayed very, very loyal to my ancestry by insisting that Sandhya is actually pronounced Sandhya. That's a little bit of that background.
Good to know.
So I'm an ordained minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, but I do come from an interfaith family. My father was Hindu from West Bengal, India. My mother is Scottish and Scottish Presbyterian, literally still has the accent. So both of my parents were immigrants, and I also immigrated to this country when I was an adorable little 2.5-year-old. So that's a little bit of my cultural background.
Great, thanks. Well, I think some of the joy for me of getting to know you is the work that you do. And, I was able to take a class over to the Oakland Peace Center.
Yes.
So please tell me about the work, and you do other things as well. So please share what you do, why you do it, how did you end up doing it, all that great stuff.
Yeah, so there's this term that gets kicked around a lot these days called the gig economy, but before white people are affected by it, people around here were calling it the hustling economy, because we all were hustling multiple jobs just to keep a roof over our head, because that's the reality of the Bay Area. So ever since I graduated from seminary, I have always worked at least 2 and usually 3 or 4 jobs. I have been super, super lucky, though, in that they have all been jobs where I get to be creative. I get to be relational. I've been really, really lucky. And also, that's a function of privilege. So I may have struggled economically, but part of that's because I always got to choose work that was really life-giving to me. And I don't take that for granted because most of my friends do not get to do that. And they remind me how spoiled I am on a regular basis. So it keeps me humble. So with that said, I came out here to the Bay Area 15 years ago, and one of my jobs was as pastor of First Christian Church, which in its heyday had 2,000 members, and that sanctuary that could seat up to 700. And by the time I got there in 2000, I actually got there in 2006, they were down to 10 people in worship. And it was predominantly an African-American congregation, largely because of white flight in the 1950s from Oakland and the impact of the crack epidemic in that neighborhood and throughout Oakland, which people who got to choose where to live didn't choose to live there. And these folks held down that space because they knew something else was coming along. And fast forward to today, that building has been repurposed as the Oakland Peace Center, which physically holds the offices of 12 different, mostly POC, people of color led nonprofits, and as well as that tiny scrappy little congregation which still exists under the leadership of Monica Cross, who's an amazing minister. And we have another 20 some partners who affiliate with us just so that we can provide solidarity and companionship and problem solving with each other, which is a big deal because nonprofits are pitted against each other for funding. They're pitted against each other, kind of stake our claims. And so the idea of actually being able to collaborate as a foundational value of an organization, and for our primary purpose being to cultivate collaboration among nonprofits, is kind of an act of resistance.
Yeah.
And it harkens back to our cultural values. So I kind of think it makes sense that a Black congregation and an Asian pastor would give birth to something that was grounded in how do we show up for each other in a world that tries to pit us against each other.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's overstating it this way, but I feel like that's the uniqueness of women of color in general and how we invite folks to the table. We do it as community and collaboration because of our cultures, but also because of the space that we hold. I love that. How being South Asian in a Black congregation, being I don't know about your family background and how they see what you're doing as work. I know for me, growing up in South Seattle, my parents worked really hard to get us out of South End, and so we got out of the South End. And then when I finished my MDiv, I went back in, and I remember my mom saying, like, "We worked really hard for you to get that, Master's of Divinity. Why are you going back in? Like, we worked hard to get out." So. Yes. Tell me about your experience in that. Or if
I'm really lucky. The only people in my family in this country were my parents. So it was just the three of us. And so I'm really lucky that my parents were always really supportive of what I did. My father was definitely a lot happier when I was working in Congress because he could hand out my business card to his friends and be like, "Look, we have arrived. We are Americans. My daughter is helping run the country." But I gotta give them both credit for the fact that they did a whole bunch to make sure I had every opportunity I could have. And when I decided to, by the standards of my community, throw all of that away to live in relative poverty, my parents showed up and supported me and encouraged me. And that's great because what I do makes absolutely no sense to my family back in India. They keep trying to make sense of it, and they keep trying to be encouraging, and God bless them for it. But it is a real puzzle to them. So I'm really grateful for the fact that even when it doesn't make sense to them, they keep showing up. And I was really grateful. A few years ago, I got to preach in the congregation that ordained me in DC. And I also got to do a workshop from my book, Transforming Communities. And I invited my parents had heard me preach a few times, and they were really supportive. And I asked them if they'd like to come to the workshop. And it kind of blew their minds because for the first time they got to witness what I do, which is function as a cheerleader for folks who want to change the world. And my parents started having to ask themselves questions about how they were engaging their own community and why they didn't know certain stories and what their role could be in retirement. And it was really, really beautiful to watch them practicing the things that I encourage people all across the country to practice, and to watch things shift in them. And I was really excited about that because I know that my work is a mystery to them in a lot of ways. I was really grateful they got to actively participate in it in that moment. It was really special.
Yeah, that's great. You know, I have a lot of Asian American friends who are talking to their parents, especially now, right? In this moment, we're talking about race and Black Lives Matter in a different way than we were before. With that shift, are you having different conversations with them, or how's that working?
Yes, I was really lucky in that my book Pre-Post Racial America came out about 6 months after the murder of Michael Brown. And what was fascinating about that is my father had never really used a racial lens to reflect on his experiences in the West. And I told stories about my parents. I told stories about their journey, stories they had told me. I didn't embellish, I didn't exaggerate. I made sure that I had gotten the details right. But when my father saw it in a book that was also talking about the experience of Latinx immigrants and African Americans and Asian refugees, he started thinking, oh, wait, those things I went through, that was racism. And it was fascinating because a year later, my parents were traveling someplace and I asked my parents how their trip was, and my father said, he was in his 80s, I got pulled out by TSA and they did a body search, and that's racism. In his 80s was the first time he was actually willing to admit, because part of how folks survive, a lot of our first generation folks who are incredibly brave and go through horrific things, part of how they survive is to not acknowledge that's what's happening to them.
Yeah.
And I respect that. And there was something for my father about him being able to say, I have experienced racism in this country that I love, opened him up, because he was just that kind of man. It opened him up to saying, oh, what's happening to Obama right now is racism. Oh, what happened to Michael Brown was racism.
Yeah.
Oh, what's happening with policing, even though I don't have to deal with that part of racism, that's racism.
Yeah.
So I was really grateful for that. I was talking with my mother about the fact that we have been watching a lot of the movies that help us think about anti-Black racism during quarantine while she's in Maryland and I'm here in California. We've watched 13th together. We've watched Just Mercy together. I asked her what she was doing for the movement for Black Lives, and she said nothing. And I thought that was going to be the end of the conversation. But then she said, well, what should I be doing? And so I said, so here's 3 things. You could get your book club to reactivate and read some books about race. And she asked me for some recommendations, and I recommended several Black women authors that I thought her group could handle, but that weren't going to, sugarcoat things. And I said, here's a few charities you could invest in. You could invest in, Black Girls Code because you like to build up the next generation and you're an educator. Or you could donate to the bail fund because you know that the prison industrial complex is broken and Black young adults on the front lines could use that support. And she did. It was fascinating. We watched 13th together this week. And she, afterwards, when we were debriefing, she said, I felt really good that I had donated to the bail fund. Because I was watching that movie and thinking the system is so broken, and I already knew that, but I chose something immediate and practical, and I want to keep doing that kind of work right now. It was really beautiful. I'm really lucky. And I have spent 25 years having these conversations with my parents. So I don't want to act like it magically swung, that it was just suddenly everything opened up. my father voted for Reagan the first time we were allowed to vote in this country. And so for him to shift to, that kind of framework, for him to suddenly become a passionate supporter of the other political party, that was the result of years and years and years of conversations. The one thing I'm really grateful for is Bengali culture really celebrates debate almost as a sport, right? And so my father didn't need me to agree with him all the time.
Yeah.
The fact that I was cultivating skills in debate was his parenting. And so we had conversations about things where I was like, I can't believe that you're blaming people on welfare for being on welfare. And he'd be like, well, tell me why I shouldn't. And so it was decades of that kind of conversation, and our culture really creating space for that, that allowed that to happen.
Yeah, no, that's great. I remember when I was 14 arguing with my dad about affirmative action.
Yes.
And I actually had the white lens, right? I was like, well, I grew up in the same neighborhood, we went to the same schools. Why should I have more opportunity? And he would push back on me. And yeah, that was a teaching and formative moment for me.
Yes.
Having my dad push my understanding.
Yes.
And then it's kind of flipped back and forth as we've gone.
Oh yeah. But that's the magical thing, is when we are all helping each other grow, right? I've definitely had those moments where my parents are like, so let us tell you, here's what it was like to live through a famine, just to give you some perspective on your nice, cute ideas. Or here's what it was like to grow up in post-war Britain, like to have been born while the bombs were falling. And for that to kind of reframe like all of my privilege, right? For my parents to be like, no, let me tell you a thing. Like, things might seem hard. Let me tell you what hard really looks like. That's part of the debate as well.
That's the part to me that blows my mind, is particularly as second generation Asian Americans, we've grown up with a history that wasn't ours. So we've grown up reading the white history. Some of us African American history, very little Latinx, very little Asian American. But then our parents have a whole other history, and that's also our ancestors' history of suffering and war and all sorts of other things.
Colonization, absolutely.
That culminates into our very bodies in the present. And it's that trips me out, that we don't have just one linear history that we come from.
Right.
We're an amalgamation of a lot of different stories.
Right. Yeah, I was recently saying to somebody that understanding African American history, I see it, and increasingly, I'm sad it took me longer with understanding Indigenous history in this country, is part of the rent I pay to be an American. I think that should be true for everybody.
Yeah.
But I think it is particularly important to me for us as Asian Americans. I mean, we don't even know our own history. We might know our history from back home, but the history of Asians in America is also so important to watch the way it is woven in and out. I know that we're going to be talking a little bit about that issue of being a wedge, but I think part of why we're used as a wedge is we don't know our history, the history of our non-biological ancestors in this country.
Well, let's talk more into that. Let's go into that, being the wedge between the model minority and then also the Kung Flu. So there's like whatever the white supremacist system decides we are that day.
So that's the thing. I think that's so important, is talking about our membership here is conditional. And the fact of the matter is, if we look at the history of Asians in this country, we have never been welcomed as equals, but we have absolutely been welcomed as position yourself against Black folks and you'll get more stuff, right? And there are really, really powerful stories of Black-brown solidarity that I have been grateful to be exposed to by the blackdesisecrethistory.org website, which tells the stories of times that South Asians have chosen solidarity with the Black community, the ways that we have shown up for each other and built each other up. I think those stories are particularly important in this era, because the weird double-edged sword of redlining, where certain people are allowed to buy in certain communities and other people are not, which was the law of the land for a long time and still functions in a de facto way, even though it's not de jure, it's not by law. The weird double-edged sword of us being a wedge is there are a lot of white communities we're not allowed to buy into. And you know where we are allowed to buy stuff? In Black communities where Black people have not been allowed to, have been systematically stopped from generating wealth that would allow them to own their stores, or when their wealth has been taken away, so they've lost their stores, and we're allowed in that space so that we won't be in white spaces.
Right.
And there is a deep and understandable antagonism between South Asian and Black communities, because the primary relationship point for a lot of my Black friends with South Asians is we own the stores and we treat them like, I'm trying to filter, we treat them badly. There we go.
We might need to make this an unfiltered thing.
Yeah. Because we have been trained into anti-Blackness before we even get here. Because colonialism is a mother. It is deep. It runs really deep, and it intersects with the colorism that we've been trained into already back in our home countries. And so we get this fake message of what Blackness is and who Black people are, and we perpetuate it, and we're in the spaces that white folks won't go. And we do their work for them. We replicate this false narrative in our direct interactions. And I can hear a number of my South Asian friends being like, not all South Asians. It's true. Some of us don't have to interact with Black folks. So that's, I didn't mean to get into the why we suck, because I really do think there is this long history also of times that South Asians and Asians in general were like, nah, we see how this game is played. We know that we're never going to be treated the same way that white people are treated. We know who our solidarity needs to be with. It needs to be with other immigrants. It needs to be with Black folks. We have not done our work with Indigenous folks, but that's going to be your next series of podcasts, I imagine. Let's stay where we're supposed to stay, and let's talk about that another time for sure.
Yeah, well, we have to do a whole other season on that, because it's deeply related to us. It's we aren't compartmentalized in our beings, that we don't connect to the Indigenous issues, sexuality issues. Our identities are holistic and complicated and interrelated with one another. So all of that. I think you mentioned something really interesting, right? Like, not all South Asians need to interact with the Black community. And I think there's a lot of, and then you also have just sort of the narratives. I was talking to a Korean American man the other day, and he admitted he grew up in LA, but he just grew up with mostly white people and didn't have any Black friends and didn't have even very many Asian friends. How did you end up in the work and the communities that you're in? How did this change? For me, I think we grew up in a Black neighborhood, or when I was younger, and then we moved to the suburbs, and then, so I had different experiences. But being brown, I identified with darker folks. What was it like for you?
So I think that's a really good question. For me, like I said, we moved to the US when I was a toddler, and we moved to Akron, Ohio, but we pretty quickly moved to the rural area outside of Akron, which meant I was in a predominantly white school, adjacent to a city that was predominantly Black, and the city where my father worked and where anything interesting happened, right? And also a post-industrial city. And I gotta say, that's where I'm at home. I'm at home with working folks, and the reality is I'm at home with folks who wish they were working folks, and folks who are overworking because the good jobs are gone. And that tends, my mother grew up at post-war Britain, so like there's something saturated deep into me about post-industrial spaces. That said, so I grew up in this mostly white community. When I was in first grade, my father took me and my mother to see the movie Gandhi, right? It came out when I was in first grade. It was a very big deal for me because I was going to a movie at 8 p.m., which was actually my bedtime. And it was a 3-hour movie. And that movie impacted me profoundly. I probably shouldn't have seen some of the stuff that was going on in it because it illustrates the reality of the brutality of the British Empire. We sometimes pretend like the British were like really harmless as opposed to, say, the Nazis or whatever, right? But actually, brutal regime that probably killed more people over time because they got to do it for longer. Brutal, violent, horrific regime, intentionally starved Indians. Like when I talk about the famine in India, there was enough rice being grown in India, and Churchill knew that there was enough rice, and he was like, but we might need it later. So let them die.
Wow.
Let them not have access to the rice that they grew. So the famine that my father lived through was actually an avoidable famine.
Right.
So anyhow, having grown up with that story, so in my bag, sorry. So in first grade, I saw this movie, hugely impacted by it. And then it wasn't until, and in school, never heard anything except for white histories. I think we did some activity in second grade about Native Americans, but otherwise, nothing but white history. In fourth grade, we learn about Martin Luther King for the first time. And we learn about the fact that his commitment to nonviolence was shaped by Gandhi. And I'm like, oh, holy sh!
Yes.
I'm really trying Inheritance Magazine.
It's okay.
So I'm like, oh, holy cow. This is my first connection point with any history in America. So it was easy for me to be like, oh, so I have nothing that represents me in this country right now, except for Black folks. That's my only connection point. I read every book I can find on Martin Luther King. I get my music teacher to play the chords to We Shall Overcome that's in the back of one of the books. And I recognize in retrospect, this means I ended up functioning in a lot of appropriative ways, right? Like I grew up on hip hop music. I did not have the right to claim those stories. Those were not my stories. They were the only stories I had access to that weren't white stories.
That's for a lot of people of color.
Yeah, so it's super complicated, and I've been trying to do my work around that in the years since then. But I think the one potentially good thing about that is it meant that I didn't have to try to figure out how to fit into the white story, because at least there was one other story out there for me. And then as I got older, I started learning, like I said, these solidarity stories, and I started learning what were the powerful resistance stories within the South Asian narrative. And I started learning what it meant to not take over somebody else's culture as a way of making sense of the world I lived in. And so that's kind of the journey I've been on since then. So I think I'm pretty well grounded in who I am and who I'm not. And I think that's really important I think it's why I'm able to be in relationship with a lot of anti-racist African-American colleagues, is because I'm real clear. I'm not trying to be Black. I'm not trying to be anything other than who I am. I'm trying really hard to be grounded in my own history and my own narratives so I can show up better in solidarity with my Black family.
Yeah. And I think that's the best positioning we have to be in the wedge, right? Is not over-identifying with either side of the binary, but really understanding who we are and making a stake in that. And yeah, that's beautiful. Well said. Well, this time goes by.
We're at a half hour. Oh my gosh.
We're at a half hour. Are there any last things that you'd like to share? I mean, you dropped a lot of wonderful organizations and books and places we can donate and things we can do. And we'll list that all. We'll put links to all of that. Any last words that you'd like to share with whoever?
I will also shamelessly be like, hey, I've got a book on this subject, and I am teaching a 6-week course starting September 2nd on the exact same thing. So if you want to delve more deeply into this, there are lots of places to do it. That's one of them.
Please reach on this book. She's very practical in the way that she writes, and yet very deeply well read.
So let's be clear, I'm a nerd. There's no getting around it. I'm just a nerd who also quotes hip hop occasionally.
but you're a nerd with your elbows deep in the ground, and I think that's the beauty of how you write and how you teach. So yes, please read anything that Shonda's written, and I'm so glad to have you here. But oh yeah, so was that your last plug, or
yeah, it's my last plug.
Feel free. I want to show the world everything, or the world of whoever watches this on YouTube.
I love it.
But thank you so much. I really appreciate you and what you do, and your
Likewise.
presence in Oakland. It's been an honor and a joy to walk with you in this, and we'll keep going. And anyway, just thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Joyce.
Thanks.